Hey everyone, Lisel Crowley here at the Cool Tools Studio. Today I'm going to show you how to make this awesome cuff using some new easy release textures that Cool Tools is offering. We're also going to use these wonderful nano gems to add some visual sparkle and color to the design. These are the easy release textures. I absolutely love them. They come in a variety of wonderful designs and you're going to have fun working with them. Let's get started. Okay, so these are the tools we're going to need for this project. First of all, you want a texture, and again, I really recommend these easy release textures. They're nice and large, so it gives you enough space to get the size you need for your cuff, and there's a lot of great patterns that would lend themselves well to cuff designs. And there's many more besides these. You can check them out on the Cool Tools website. Again, I think you're going to love them. We want a tough card that's long enough to accommodate a cuff. We want the nano gems, and I really like the nano gems because they can be fired in place. They don't lose their color or their sparkle. You can use fireable cubic zirconias as well. I just happen to really love the colors that these nano gems come in, so I recommend that you give them a shot. We're going to use EZ960 clay. I would say this project is going to take around 25 grams, so we're going to start out with that. We need a work surface. I'm using the clay board, which is my favorite work surface. One of the reasons I love this work surface so much is not only because the clay releases easily from it, but it's on 4 feet. And that allows me to be working on a level surface no matter where I am. And I really need level surface to get clear, smooth rolls out of my clay. Okay, so we also need a tape measure for measuring the wrist, a clay pick for cutting out the clay, and this is the best clay cutting tool ever, a cutter and scraper, a Sharpie. This is a biopsy punch. It's a 5mm biopsy punch, a brush and water, some lubricant, a clay roller, bracelet mandrel, some thickness frames, some tweezers, a coil roller, and a hydrator for keeping the clay moist while we're working. Let's get started. Okay, so the very first thing that we want to do is set our gemstone, and that's because we need that to dry. We need the bezel to dry and be sanded before we actually make the cuff. So I'm not even going to measure or prepare for the cuff until I've set my gemstone. And the first part of that process is determining the depth of the gemstone. And for that, I'm going to use my frames and my coil roller. So let me get those ready. And I'm going to start with, let's see, this is 6 and 5, so this is 11 cards. And the way I determine if I'm deep enough is just running my coil roller over the top. And you can see that the stone is not, sometimes it moves and sometimes it doesn't. So that means I'm right close to the depth I need. So I'm just going to add 2 cards. And now I'm definitely deep enough. So this is how deep I want to go for my gemstone. I'm going to take a tough card, and I'm going to take a fairly large piece of soft clay. Now you want your clay to be fresh or freshly reconstituted. And again, this is EZ960 clay. And the first thing I'm going to do is roll it into a ball. And you want to use the coil roller to do this. You don't want to use your hands. The less you handle the clay, the better, because your hands are hot and they will pull moisture out of the clay. Once I have a ball rolled, I'm going to place my guides and just flatten it into a patty. So now that I've got my nice flat patty, I'm going to take my biopsy punch and I want to go straight down, twist, and lift straight up. And I want that clay to come out nice and cleanly, and it did. Always remember to take a second to reclaim your clay from the punch. For 2 reasons. One, you want to reclaim the clay, but the other is you don't want to clog up your punch. Now I'm going to take my stone. Now this is a 5mm stone, and I used a 4mm biopsy punch. You want the hole for the stone to be slightly smaller than the stone because you want the clay to grab onto the stone once you set it. I'm keeping my guides in place. I'm just going to press with my coil roller, and that gets that stone perfectly under the surface. Now, for this particular project, I want to have a square bezel for a round stone. You can make the bezel any shape you want, but I'm going to hand trim it using my cutter. And I do it by eye. If you're uncomfortable doing that, you can always use a template. And it can be any shape you want, really. I just happen to like a square. And if your cutter begins to accumulate a little bit of clay residue, clean that off because it'll allow you to get a cleaner cut. And I'm not going for perfection. If it's not a perfect square, I'm not going to worry about it. It's an organic piece. Now, once I have that completely cut, I'm going to put my guides back down and do a final press with my coil roller. And the reason I do that is that as you're cutting, it can jar the clay a little bit. This just makes sure everything is nice and level. And finally, there are some tiny, tiny hairline cracks. I'm just going to brush some water to soften those up. And I can sand them away also later. But I find that brushing it with water helps soften them up and makes it easier to sand them away. So this will get set aside to dry, it'll be sanded, and then we'll make the cuff. Okay, so the first thing about making anything that involves size is, of course, making sure you work in the right length. And I find that when you make a cuff, you have to have a gap or an opening so it is easy to put on and take off. So I have found in the use of EZ960, what works for me is measuring the exact circumference of my wrist, and when I make the cuff that length, after firing it has the right size gap. So I'm going to measure my wrist, and of course you would measure the wrist of whoever you're making it for. And I'm going to measure right around where I would wear the cuff. So if you wanted to wear the cuff higher up on your arm, you would measure there. And I come up with 6.5 inches. So I know that my cuff needs to be 6.5 inches long. And then after firing, it will have be the right length for putting on and taking off. And this tough card is just a little bit over 6.5 inches. So what I usually do is make a mark to indicate where I need my cuff to start and stop. And Sharpie works great. Okay, now that that's prepared, the next step is for me to actually roll out my cuff. I'm going to use about 25 grams of EZ960 clay. And EZ960 is the clay I recommend for this project. You need something that's going to have the strength of a sterling clay, but I like EZ960 for its low shrinkage and ease of firing. And also we're going to be shaping it after firing, so you need that strength for that as well. So about 25 grams should be enough to make the cuff that we're going to make today. And what I like to do for a cuff is end up with 5 cards thick. So I'm going to roll it out 6 cards and texture down to 4, and the average between the 6 and the 4 will give me the 5 cards. Now, because of the length, I'm going to need 2 frames. Now, I've got one 6-card frame, but I can also put the 2 and the 4 together, and therefore I have 2 6-cards frame. And I'm just going to roll it. And I like to roll and flip the clay, so I'm not rolling it always on one side. Now at 6 cards thick, I've only got about 3.5 inches, so this is not going to be long enough. So I know I need more than 25 grams of clay. In the end, I won't use all 25 grams, but it's better to start out with more than you need than not having enough. So I'm going to take some more clay. Just going to add it right on top. And this will give me the length I need. It's also going to give me plenty of width, which I'm going to want. Okay, next I'm going to get the texture ready and roll out the texture. So to lubricate these textures, you don't need a lot of lube, which is great because it doesn't contaminate the clay. So I'm just going to lube from a distance, a very light mist, and then spread that around. And I'm going to go in this direction because I want to make it longer. And again, because of length, I need 2 guides on either side. So I have actually 2 4-card thick guides here. And I'm going to start from one direction and roll with a very firm, even pressure. See how cleanly that releases? And look at how beautiful that texture is. So now we're going to put it on my measured card. And it's just a little longer than I need it to be, which is perfect. And the next step is cutting out the design. And the design is built into the texture. And I want to follow the line of these thicker lines. So I'm going to start. I'm going to anchor my clay with one finger, and I'm anchoring it very gently. I'm not pressing hard. And I'm going to go in segments. And I'm not trying to get perfect because I can sand it, but I'd rather have it a little outside the line than cut away that nice crisp line on the outside edge. And I do want to keep the tapered ends because I think that looks nice. Pull all this away. And then I'm going to turn it around to do the other side. Now you could go 1 level thick, 2 levels thick, or 3 levels thick. I'm going to go with 3 to make a nice wide cuff. And depending if you want a wide cuff or a narrow cuff, you could play with this design however you want. And again, you're pulling away all this excess clay. So you see, even though we started with a lot of clay, we still have quite a bit of clay left. And now I'll just come back, and if there's any areas that I feel like I need to fine-tune with cutting, again, I'm going to do most of my refining with sanding. But if there's any places where I feel like it really, could benefit from being cut away a little bit more, I'll do a little of that now, like right here. And that just saves clay, because all this clay can be reused for something else. And before I set this aside to dry, I'm going to want to figure out where I want my stone to go. Now the stone is not yet dried and sanded, but I can decide where I want it to go. Because this is a cuff and it's going to sit on the wrist, it's going to go right in this central area. If I don't put it in this central area, and if it's out here where I have to bend it quite a bit, it can cause a problem when we go to bend it. So I know I want the stone somewhere near the center. So I'm just going to take my biopsy punch again and pick an area somewhat in the center. And it doesn't have to be smack dab in the center, but just in the general vicinity of the center, and push a hole in there. And that's where my stone is going to go. So after this is dried and the stone is dried and sanded, I'll put the two together and then they'll be dried and fired. So here we have the piece that's been thoroughly dried, and I've sanded it very carefully along the edge. I've also sanded the back so it will be nice and smooth to wear. I've also sanded the bezel on my gemstone, and now it's time for me to attach my stone to my piece. And what I like to do is just dip the whole thing right in water so it's nice and wet, and get it positioned. And I slightly wiggle it until it grabs. And I'll let that sit and dry. And once that's completely dried, I'll clean the stone off with alcohol, and then we'll fire it. My favorite firing schedule for EZ960 in my kiln, which has been tested, is to ramp at full speed to 675, hold for 15 minutes for the binder to burn out, then ramp at full speed to 1675 and hold for 2 hours. I find my clay comes out fully sintered and it is not overfired. Again, that's in my kiln. It's very important that you test your kilns before you fire EZ960 because it fires very close to the melting temperature. Okay, so we have fired the cuff and it's ready to finish. The first thing we're going to do is test it for surface sintering with the water test, and I'll show you how to do that right now. So here's the piece that's been fired. You can see how beautiful the texture looks and how nice and sparkly the stone is. To do the water test, I'm actually going to test on the back where it's smooth. I just think it works easier on a smooth surface. And I'm just going to take my brush and drop some water on there. And see how that water is beading up? That tells me that the piece is surface sintered. If that water gets soaked into the piece, you know the piece is not sintered and you should refire. It's always a good idea when you're going to bend a piece of EZ960 to do this test first. So now I'm going to take my bracelet mandrel, and I'm just going to take my piece and very gently start to bend it using my hands. Now, you might wonder why I haven't brushed the piece yet. And that's because even the act of brushing can start to harden the metal, and that will make it harder to bend. So I usually bend first and then do my brushing and finishing. So now that I've got it basically bent, I'm just going to anchor the piece on the back and use my rawhide mallet to conform it to the mandrel and get the shape I want. And you would work higher up on the mandrel for a smaller cuff and lower down on the mandrel for a larger cuff. And you can always adjust the size once it's complete. So let me just try this on. And you can see how nicely it fits the wrist. The gap is perfect for putting on and taking off. So now I'll just give it a quick brush so you can see how pretty it looks. And I prefer a steel brush because it works faster and you don't need to use soap and water. You can also brush with a brass brush, but it takes a little longer because the brass brush is softer and you do need to use soap and water. As far as the inside of the cuff goes, I typically tumble my pieces, so the inside will get burnished when it's tumbled, so I don't really need to worry about brushing the inside. Brush will not hurt the stone, and neither will tumbling. So you don't have to worry about that. One thing I would worry about is if you're doing hand finishing with abrasives, then I would avoid the stone. But just brushing with the steel brush and tumbling is not going to hurt the stone. So there you have the cuff. I typically will tumble polish and then add patina and then bring it to a satin finish. I prefer a satin finish on my pieces, especially my textured pieces. But you could finish it however you want. You could have it bright and shiny, or you could even leave it with just a brushed finish, and it will look lovely either way. This is a really fun project. I also have a companion video on how to make a ring using this texture. If you haven't seen that yet, you might enjoy watching it. It's a lot of fun. I hope you have fun making these and wearing them.
Visit our Learning Center at cooltools.us for more cool jewelry making videos. Subscribe to our YouTube channel like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and be sure to sign up for our email list to be the first to hear about new videos, new products, and other cool stuff from Cool Tools.